Hello, crime enthusiasts. Are you ready for another chilling investigation? The case of Andrea Lohagin. Andrea Lohagin was born on January 6, 1977, in Bad Belzig, Germany, to a tight-knit family that consisted of her mother, father, and sister. They lived in a newly built residential complex. As children, Andrea and her sister were known for being obedient and diligent in their studies, which made their parents incredibly proud. By the time Andrea turned 16, she had developed into a stunning young woman and an outstanding student, earning her numerous admirers. Andrea and her sister focused primarily on their studies and socializing with friends at parties, avoiding any unwholesome or troubling pursuits. On October 7, 1993, during the autumn break, 16 years old, Andrea spent the day at a local shopping center with her parents. With only 1 year of high school remaining, Andrea was on the cusp of a significant milestone, looking forward to completing her exams and embarking on her journey into adulthood. Andrea harbored dreams of attending university, building a career, and eventually starting a family of her own. The thought of entering this new phase of her life filled her with immense excitement and anticipation. During their outing to the shopping center, Andrea bought new shoes and jeans. She excited to wear them to a party at the club that was coming up soon. That evening, Andrea, a high school student, planned to attend a gathering at the local youth center, where her friends and acquaintances were waiting for her. The center was only a 15-minute walk from Andrea's home in the small town of Bad Belzig. Since the town was considered very safe, with no prior incidents of attacks or crimes, Andrea's parents felt comfortable allowing her to walk to the party alone. Andrea was expected to return home by 10 p.m. to watch a horror movie with her mother, as was their evening routine. However, when Andrea did not come home on time, her family assumed she would be home in a few hours. Andrea's friends who were at the party said she never showed up, which caused them to become worried. This was unusual behavior for Andrea, who was known for being responsible and punctual. She had never been late before, so her friends were worried. Unfortunately, it was difficult to reach Andrea directly, as mobile phones were not widely used at the time, and the youth center didn't have a landline phone. Her friends would have had to leave the party to call her from another location. Nevertheless, the group chose not to jump to conclusions and stayed at the club. They thought Andrea might be dealing with family issues that prevented her from attending the party. Despite the youth center being close by, none of them tried to check on her. The girls assumed Andrea was either running late or grounded at home, and they continued to enjoy the party. However, when Andrea failed to return home by midnight, her mother grew worried. Normally, Andrea would be home by this time, watching another horror movie. At first, Andrea's mother thought she came home late because she had gone out with friends or visited someone's house. But as the hours passed and Andrea didn't show up, her mother became increasingly alarmed. She tried to contact her daughter's friends, with whom Andrea was supposed to be visiting that evening, but none of them were home. This left her unable to get any information about Andrea's whereabouts. Later, one of the girls finally answered, but she had no information about Andrea. The mother became increasingly worried, realizing that her daughter could not stay out so late, as she had to go to school the next day. At 1 a.m., the mother's concern reached a breaking point. She woke up her husband, and they set out in their car at 1:30 a.m. to search for Andrea. They spent hours searching the area around Bad Belzig but found nothing. They visited the youth center, but Andrea wasn't there. Andrea's friends were unable to provide a clear explanation for her disappearance. It was also unknown whether she went missing while heading to the club or after leaving it. Most partygoers had already left, and the remaining youths couldn't provide much information. Around 4 a.m., Andrea's frantic parents reported her disappearance to the local police. However, the police responded slowly and failed to conduct a timely search for Andrea. The police officers initially thought that Andrea had just gone out and would come back home by herself in the morning, once she was sober. However, her parents were certain that something terrible had happened to her. They knew Andrea wouldn't run away because she had no reason to do so. All Andrea's belongings and money were still at home, she wasn't dating anyone, and none of her friends had seen her that night. A week went by before the police started investigating Andrea's disappearance. Up until then, her parents had been searching the town on their own. They had contacted all the local hospitals, but none of them had any information about Andrea. As the search continued without any success, Andrea's parents became increasingly suspicious of a plot of land formerly owned by Andrea's ex-boyfriend's grandfather. Andrea and her ex-boyfriend had broken up shortly before she went missing. There were reports that her ex-boyfriend was struggling to cope with their breakup. The outside of the property appeared abandoned, except for a small, old shed that caught the attention of Andrea's parents. They suspected that Andrea's ex-boyfriend might be connected to her disappearance. They thought it was possible that he had ambushed her on her way to the club, attacked her, and taken her. The parents immediately contacted Andrea's ex-boyfriend, but he denied any involvement. He stated that he was at home for the entire evening and night, and his family members were ready to confirm his alibi. However, Andrea's family didn't believe him. The police were informed by Andrea's parents about a suspicious piece of land owned by her ex-boyfriend's grandfather, and they agreed to investigate. It wasn't until a week after Andrea's disappearance that the police took the investigation seriously. Detectives started questioning the people who were at the youth club on the night Andrea went missing. Many of the partygoers were friends and acquaintances of Andrea, but their statements didn't shed any light on the case. The teenagers who frequented the club often got their dates and days mixed up, making their accounts confusing and unclear. Some people claimed to have seen Andrea at the party, but others disagreed. Initially, investigators thought Andrea might have arrived at the party, then gotten lost in the crowd or left with someone she knew, or possibly been attacked. This theory seemed believable, given that parties with teenagers often involve alcohol, which can lead to incidents when people are leaving. However, after talking to more witnesses, it became clear that Andrea never actually made it to the party, which was confirmed by her friends who were waiting for her. Andrea, who was known for her beauty at school, didn't show up to meet her friends. Detectives believed the accounts from Andrea's closest friends were the most trustworthy. Police have thoroughly checked all routes Andrea might have taken to get to the club. They launched a large-scale search operation, involving trained dogs and many volunteers. Despite their extensive efforts, they couldn't find any signs of Andrea. Numerous press conferences and TV reports were held to ask citizens for help in finding Andrea and warning them of potential danger. Andrea's parents and law enforcement worked together to investigate her disappearance. They made appeals for negotiation in case she was abducted, set up hotlines for witness tips, and offered monetary rewards. However, all efforts were unsuccessful due to a lack of evidence or leads. Many tips were verified, but they turned out to be false. The detectives were only able to piece together a rough timeline of incident leading up to Andrea's disappearance. On the evening of Thursday, October 7, 1993, Andrea returned home from a shopping center with her parents around 6 p.m. She went to her room, listened to music, and looked at her new clothes. The family had dinner together, and Andrea planned to attend a party at the youth club afterwards. She tried to contact a friend to go together, but her friend was already at the club and couldn't be reached. Andrea decided to go alone, and her parents didn't know what she did next. Investigators suspected that Andrea may have been a victim of sexual assault. They thought that her attractive appearance might have caught the attention of a predator, leading to a crime. To investigate, detectives made a list of Andrea's ex-boyfriends and admirers, and checked their alibis. Investigation found that each of the suspects had a reliable alibi for the time of the incident, making it unlikely they were involved. Unfortunately, the surveillance system at the time was relatively underdeveloped, making the investigation more difficult. Detectives started looking for witnesses who might have seen what happened to Andrea. They found out that she had taken a shortcut to the club that evening, and several people had seen her along the way. According to their accounts, Andrea had passed by a group of young people and a couple of teenagers. But she didn't know any of them, so she just kept walking. The last people to see Andrea alive were two boys, 13-years-old Robin and 14-years-old David. By law, their identities and photos were kept private, but detectives were able to track them down and take their statements. The boys said they had simply nodded at Andrea and then gone their separate ways. After that, Andrea seemed to disappear. It became clear that Andrea never made it to the meeting spot with her friends, which meant something terrible must have happened to her on the way. The path she took was a little-known shortcut that mostly only local residents were familiar with. So, the search for suspects focused on people who lived in the nearby houses. Immediately, the police investigation focused on Robin and David, the two teenagers who were the last to see Andrea alive. Both boys came from difficult home environments and lived close to the Andrea family's residence. They were familiar with the path Andrea had taken. Although they were young, Robin and David had a history of minor crimes, including thefts and break-ins. However, there was not enough evidence to accuse them of a serious crime like assault and abduction. Due to Robin and David's young age, the suspicions against them were eventually dropped. The case stalled, and for the next 7 years, there were no new developments. Then, on July 7, 2000, a local resident stumbled upon a horrifying discovery while out for a walk. His dog found a human skull and brought it to him, laying it on the ground. At first, the man thought the skull was a ball, but after he realized it was actually a human skull that had been stripped of its flesh. The skull had a hole in the occipital bone. At first, the resident thought the dog had discovered old remains from World War II, as burials from that time were commonly found in the area. To be safe, the resident informed the police. When detectives received the news, they quickly went to the scene with search dogs. The location where the skull was found belonged to Andrea's former boyfriend. After a lengthy and thorough search, a complete human skeleton was found behind the door of a partially collapsed shed, hidden under a pile of construction debris. The skeleton's poor condition made initial identification impossible. Searching the nearby utility building did not turn up any clues, personal items, pieces of clothing, or other evidence. In recent years, the only person to have gone missing without a trace in the area was Andrea Lohajian. Consequently, most people immediately assumed the remains belonged to her. Andrea's parents described the outfit she wore on the day of her disappearance, including new black platform shoes and jeans purchased that day. However, none of these clothing items were discovered in the shed, which implies that the perpetrators likely got rid of them. It was also possible that Andrea's clothes were torn off shortly before her death, perhaps during an attempted assault. The remains were only identified as Andrea's after a thorough forensic examination, including an analysis of dental records. This allowed Andrea's family to learn the truth about her fate and give her a proper burial. However, it also sparked concerns about how thorough the initial searches were, since her body was found in an area that had already been searched before. A review of the search operation reports showed that investigators had examined the area, including an abandoned shed filled with debris, but they didn't find anything unusual at the time. It is possible that the body was hidden there later, but there is no evidence to confirm this. The investigation initially concentrated on the accounts of witnesses who claimed to have seen Andrea in the company of two teenagers, Robin and David, aged 13 to 14, just before her disappearance. Andrea's vanishing after being seen with Robin and David had seemed suspicious. The boys were questioned again and repeated that they had seen Andrea on the night she disappeared, but had only greeted her and had no involvement in her disappearance. Despite the lack of evidence, but the investigation still points to their involvement in Andrea's disappearance. It seemed unlikely that such young boys could be responsible for her murder, but their involvement couldn't be ruled out entirely. Further investigation revealed that the boys had a connection to the location where Andrea's remains were found. Witnesses had seen Robin and David near the shed on several occasions, and it was discovered that they had access to the inside of the abandoned building. Additionally, eyewitnesses reported seeing the boys at the entrance of the shed on the evening Andrea went missing, raising more questions and increasing suspicions about Robin and David's involvement in the crime. The investigation into the involvement of Robin and David in Andrea's disappearance was dropped due to insufficient evidence and their young age. At the time, detectives didn't think it was plausible for schoolboys to be involved in the crime. The search for Andrea continued. But authorities, media, and her family failed to uncover any valuable information. The case hit a dead end, and it was eventually shelved as unsolved. Without direct evidence pointing to a killer, detectives stopped their search. It wasn't until 2012, when new leadership took over the regional police department, that the case was reopened. Although new evidence and leads were discovered, there still wasn't enough proof to charge anyone. At this point, detectives didn't have a prime suspect. In May 2016, the case took a major turn when David, a 37-year-old man, died in Berlin from a serious pancreatic disease caused by years of drug addiction and unsettled lifestyle. He was one of the teenagers who had last seen Andrea alive. During a train trip, David suffered a fatal internal hemorrhage, and his death certificate listed natural causes, despite his extensive criminal history. Following David's death, a witness came forward to the authorities, claiming to have information that could solve Andrea's murder case. David's mother was a witness, but she concealed the disturbing truth about her son's involvement in the case. She revealed that on the evening of the murder in 1993, David, then 14, and his 13-year-old friend Robin encountered Andrea while walking on the same path. The two boys, drawn to Andrea's fashionable clothing, decided to attack and rob her. When Andrea recognized them in the darkness, fearing they would be exposed, Robin and David brutally killed her. The investigators were shocked by a sudden turn of events. They had previously suspected Robin and David of a crime, but lacked evidence to prosecute them. The boys' involvement was also questionable due to their young age. Until then, the boys, Robin and David, had gotten into only minor scrapes with the law and had managed to avoid punishment due to their youth. No one suspected that this lack of punishment would embolden them to commit more serious crimes. Years later, 36-year-old Robin was brought in for questioning. His former accomplice, David, had since passed away, so the police had to rely on Robin's testimony. Robin confessed to everything, including the gruesome details of the crime. He asked to speak with his family first, to confess to them, before providing a final statement to the investigators. The detectives agreed to give Robin 48 hours to meet with his family, appreciating his willingness to cooperate. However, they had no idea that Robin had already planned his next move. When he returned to his apartment, his wife was temporarily away. Robin left a note for his wife and a message for the police, detailing his involvement in the attack on Andrea Lohajian. Then, he disappeared without a trace. 2 days later, Robin was declared missing after he failed to show up. On November 4, 2016, a hunter discovered his body in the mountains. Robin's mutilated body was found at the bottom of a deep ravine. It appeared that Robin had taken his own life, so unable to cope with the guilt he committed in his youth. In his final note, Robin described the horrific details of the crime. Robin never knew why David started the attack, as David never shared his reasons with him. Despite this, Robin was able to recall the rest of what happened during the incident. According to Robin, they had no prior connection to the victim, Andrea Lohajian. When Andrea was walking along a small road near a club, she met Robin and David. The attack was a sudden and spontaneous act of aggression. Andrea probably chose that route to get to the party quickly and save time. When Robin thought back to the encounter, he remembered exchanging friendly greetings with Andrea alongside his friend David. Initially, Robin intended to continue his journey home, but his plans changed unexpectedly. David suddenly and aggressively attacked Andrea, catching both her and Robin off guard. After the assault, Robin and David concealed Andrea's body in a nearby outbuilding adjacent to the youth center. They covered the body with construction materials and then left the area. According to Robin's account, there was no apparent motive for the attack, such as theft or personal gain. The act seemed to be driven by a senseless and extreme aggression. Robin and David both had encounters with drug dealers while they were in school. Additionally, they were both under the influence of drugs on the night the incident occurred. Peter Lemon, the head of the youth center that Andrea was planning to visit, had fond memories of her. He described Andrea as a well-behaved guest who did not drink alcohol and mainly came to the center to play billiards and socialize with friends. Peter was deeply shocked by the violence against Andrea and provided full cooperation to the authorities investigating the incident. Peter had also been told about Robin and David. They often seen loitering near a shed a short distance from the club. There were numerous negative rumors going around about these boys, but Peter couldn't bring himself to believe that such young people were capable of committing such severe offenses. However, it turned out that these very juveniles had been roaming freely. For 20 years, Andrea's disappearance remained unsolved, despite a written confession from Robin and witness testimonies placing Robin and David near the scene of the crime. The investigation lacked direct evidence against the suspects, with no DNA or fingerprints found. Detectives carefully analyzed every word from Robin, including their social media posts and phone contents. The investigators were looking for clues that might suggest the suspects discussed or admitted to the crime. Shortly before his death, David's online accounts revealed ominous posts that seemed to hint at his involvement in Andrea's disappearance. But these leads were considered secondary evidence. It is presumed that David knew the investigation had reopened and was consumed by guilt. Although he did not intend to surrender to authorities, but his life had spiraled downward due to his struggle with drug addiction. David's mother believed her son's death was a sign from fate. She had been afraid to turn him in to the police, and David and his friend Robin were hesitant to share information about their past due to fear of revenge from people they used to associate with. This fear was legitimate considering David had a record of past violent behavior and convictions for drug crimes. Despite accumulating indirect evidence, one aspect of the case to horrify detectives: how could two ordinary 13 and 14-year-old boys commit such a heinous crime against Andrea? As a result, Andrea's relatives and the investigators began to suspect that a third person, an adult, might have been involved in the crime, guiding Robin and David. The investigation revealed that Andrea's death was caused by a severe head injury from a blunt object. The severity of the injury suggests it would have taken considerable physical strength to inflict it. The detectives questioned whether Robin and David could overpower an older girl and inflict such an injury. This led them to consider the possibility of an adult accomplice, which was supported by other evidence. A new suspect emerged, a man associated with Robin and David's social circle, who was significantly older. However, his name was not disclosed. Robin's testimonies and pre-death note did not mention a third accomplice, and David's mother denied the possibility. Despite this, some witness statements suggested an adult was involved. Specifically, several witnesses reported seeing a truck driver around the same age as the suspect near the shed around the time of Andrea's disappearance. Investigators were able to identify this individual and connect him to the case. In reality, Andrea and her killers, Robin and David, attended the same school. However, due to their age difference, they didn't have classes, participate in the same activities, or have common friends. They may have crossed paths in the hallways or cafeteria. Andrea may have had prior conflicts with Robin and David that intensified their dislike for her. Robin and David both came from difficult and unstable families, which led them to start using alcohol and drugs at a young age as a way to cope. On the night of the incident, they may have been under the influence of alcohol or drugs, which could have made them more aggressive. What's more remarkable is that Andrea's remains were found on a plot of land owned by a relative of one of the killers, her ex-boyfriend's grandfather. Some people believe that this resemblance cannot be a coincidence, and they suspect the involvement of her ex-boyfriend in the case. The public was shocked and outraged when it was discovered that these very teenagers were involved in the murder. The revelation led to widespread criticism, mainly because detectives had initially dismissed the case in the 1990s, citing the suspect's youth as the reason. If detectives had investigated these teenagers as suspects at the time of the crimes, it is likely that the victims' bodies would have been discovered much sooner. An earlier investigation could have helped authorities bring the killers to justice. The autopsy results showed that Andrea had a fractured skull, but the object used to inflict the injury could not be identified. The investigation relied only on a few small bones of Andrea. All that remained of the skeleton had decomposed. The investigation into the juvenile criminals relied heavily on testimonies from David's mother and notes from Robin, as no direct physical evidence was available. One of the key concerns for detectives after reopening the case was whether David and Robin had committed any new crimes during the 20-plus years they were free. While it was unlikely, the detectives could not rule out this possibility. They spoke to local residents. However, the detectives did find a history of minor crimes committed by David and Robin. Further investigation into these incidents uncovered disturbing secrets. As detectives looked into Robin's potential involvement in a recent serious crime, they discovered a disturbing incident. In January 2014, a French student named Louise went missing after meeting with friends at the university hospital. Louise had arranged to meet her friends over the phone just before leaving home, but she never arrived. When Louise's friends tried calling her, her phone went unanswered. Assuming Louise had urgent matters to attend to, her friends went home, but when Louise didn't show up for work the next day without explanation, her friends became concerned, as this was unusual for her. Louise was a responsible person, but one evening her phone was unreachable, and her whereabouts were unknown. Later, Louise's body was later discovered, and the primary suspect in her murder was identified as Robin, a juvenile who had previously been linked to the murder of Andrea and had subsequently taken his own life. What made the situation even more disturbing was that Louise personally knew Robin, but she had no idea about his dark past. As a result, she became his second victim. Despite the suspicions, proving Robin's involvement in Louise's murder was difficult due to a lack of direct evidence. The case remains unsolved, and many have criticized police for dropping the investigation into Robin and David, suspects in Andrea's 1993 murder, citing the suspect's young age at the time. The carelessness shown in handling the case allowed criminals to commit new crimes with a high likelihood. Robin's past crimes were neglected, and his case was left unsolved, ultimately leading to the death of Louise. Years earlier, Andrea's body was left to decompose, and her case was also neglected. The Andrea family feels that the young perpetrators didn't get the punishment they deserved for their crimes. Even though the killers are dead, but they were still able to live freely for a time and experience the simple joys of life. The motives behind Andrea's murder, like many other details of the case, remain unknown due to a lack of evidence. This case shows that the idea that young people are not capable of carrying out serious crimes is incorrect. Although the truth will eventually come to light, it may be too late to deliver justice. Andrea's youth, full of promise and dreams for the future, was tragically taken.